The letter hit the table with a sound like a gunshot, and Alberta Underwood felt the floor tilt beneath her feet. "You lied to me." Matthew Holloway's voice was low and controlled, which was somehow worse than shouting. He stood across the small schoolroom he had built with his own 2 hands, his broad shoulders filling the doorway, his dark eyes fixed on her with an expression she had never seen on his face before. It was not anger exactly. It was something more devastating than anger. It was betrayal wearing the mask of a man trying very hard not to fall apart. Alberta's hands were trembling. She pressed them flat against her skirt and made herself stand still. "I did not lie to you, Matthew. You did not tell me the truth." He picked up the letter again and held it out toward her, his jaw tight, a muscle working in his cheek. "There is a difference, Alberta, but right now I cannot find where that difference lives." She looked at the letter. She had known it would come eventually. She had simply let herself believe, foolishly and desperately, that it would not come before she had found the courage to tell him herself. That was the hidden motive she had been carrying like a stone in her chest since the day she arrived at the Holloway ranch. The secret that had nothing to do with the children she had been hired to teach and everything to do with the woman she was running from becoming. "Matthew, my children trust you." His voice cracked just slightly, and he turned away, pressing one hand against the doorframe as though he needed it to stay upright. "My children love you." And he stopped. He did not finish that sentence, but the unfinished words hung in the air between them like smoke, like something burning that could not be put out. Alberta stepped toward him. Outside, the wide red sky of Colorado Territory blazed toward evening, and somewhere in the distance she could hear 7-year-old Clara calling for her brother, and the ordinary beauty of it nearly broke her open entirely. "Let me explain everything," she said. "Please, everything, from the beginning." He turned back to face her, and there was that look again, the one that was not anger, the one that was worse, and he gave her a single, slow nod. "Then you had better start at the beginning," he said quietly. "Because right now all I know is that the woman I was beginning to love has a past that she decided I did not deserve to know about." Alberta closed her eyes for 1 second. 1 second to gather herself. Then she opened them, met his gaze, and began. The story of Alberta Underwood truly started in Cincinnati, Ohio, in the spring of 1878, in a schoolroom not unlike the one Matthew Holloway had built for his children, though considerably less beautiful and considerably more suffocating. Alberta had been teaching at the Millbrook Academy for girls for 3 years when she first understood that the life she was living was not the life she was meant to have. She was 24 years old, well-educated by the standards of the day, trained in letters and arithmetic and a little Latin and a great deal of social propriety, and she was slowly dying of all of it. Not physically dying, of course, but there was a particular kind of suffocation that came with being a woman of modest means in a well-appointed city, surrounded on all sides by the expectation that she would eventually marry some pale, earnest young man of decent family and stop having opinions about things like literature and the proper way to conjugate irregular verbs. The man her mother had selected was named Gerald Fitch. He was an attorney. He wore very clean collars and had a way of explaining things to Alberta as though she were one of the younger children at the Millbrook Academy, and she had been engaged to him for 11 months before she read the advertisement in the back of a church newsletter that changed everything. The advertisement had been placed by the office of the Colorado Territory School Board, which was in desperate and somewhat embarrassing need of schoolteachers willing to travel west and educate the children of ranchers, miners, and homesteaders who lived too far from any township to make regular schooling practical. The salary was modest. The conditions would be rustic. The work would be meaningful. Alberta had clipped that advertisement out of the newsletter with a pair of small scissors and hidden it in the bottom of her sewing basket for 2 weeks before she wrote back to the Colorado Territory School Board. She had then hidden their reply for another week before she finally understood that she was not going to stop thinking about it, and that the life she was constructing in Cincinnati was a kind of trap she was walking into with her eyes open and her mouth shut. Breaking the engagement to Gerald Fitch had been a production of considerable dramatic weight. Her mother had wept. Her mother's friends had wept in sympathy. Gerald himself had not wept, which Alberta found more honest about the nature of their arrangement than anything he had ever said to her directly. She had packed 2 trunks, said goodbye to the people she genuinely loved, and boarded a westbound train in April of 1878 with her heart doing something complicated and frightened inside her chest. The Colorado Territory School Board had 3 placements waiting for independent schoolteachers. 2 of them were in small towns with existing community schoolrooms. The third was a private placement at a ranch roughly 14 miles from the nearest town, a place called Holloway Ranch, where a widowed rancher with 2 young children had written to request a teacher who could come to his property and instruct his children in reading, writing, and arithmetic through the winter months when travel was difficult. Alberta had chosen Holloway Ranch without quite being able to explain why, except that something about the description of a man raising 2 children alone in the wide country of Colorado Territory had reached into her chest and pulled. She arrived on a Wednesday afternoon in early May of 1878 in a hired wagon driven by a leathery man named Cord who did not speak beyond the absolute necessary minimum, and her first view of Holloway Ranch was one she would remember for the rest of her life. The ranch sat in a wide valley between 2 gentle ridges, and the land around it had the quality of something that had been paid for with a great deal of human effort and stubbornness. There were proper fenced pastures where cattle moved in slow, indifferent herds. There was a long, low barn that had been built to last, and a ranch house that was 2 stories tall and looked like someone had started practical and then gradually added on as love grew, because one side of it had a covered porch with actual decorative scrollwork along the eave, which was an odd and charming thing to find 14 miles from anywhere. And standing on that porch, shielding his eyes against the afternoon sun, was Matthew Holloway. He was 31 years old. He was tall in the way of men who had done hard physical work since they were young, with broad shoulders and strong hands, and a quality of stillness that Alberta would come to understand was not coldness, but something more like gravity, the specific gravity of a man who had learned that the ground could give way under your feet, and so had decided to be very careful about where he put his weight. His wife had died 2 years prior. Alberta learned this in the first careful conversation she had with the local woman who did the ranch's laundry, a kind and practical person named Mrs. Deering, who visited the ranch on Tuesdays and Fridays, and who took it upon herself to explain to Alberta, with considerable gentleness and considerable detail, the situation she had stepped into. Leaner Holloway had died in the winter of 1876, of a fever that had come on fast and moved faster, leaving Matthew with a 5-year-old daughter named Clara and a 3-year-old son named James, and approximately 900 acres of cattle ranch, and a grief so deep that Mrs. Deering said the neighbors had worried about him for the better part of a year. He came back to himself eventually, Mrs. Deering told Alberta, rolling a shirt with practiced efficiency. For the children, mostly. He is a good man, Miss Underwood. A very good man. He just has not yet learned how to be a good man who does not carry everything alone. Alberta filed that information carefully in the back of her mind and went to meet her students. Clara Holloway was 7 years old and had her father's dark eyes and her late mother's red hair and an absolute uncontainable enthusiasm for everything that could be known. She had been trying to teach herself to read from an old almanac she had found in the barn, with mixed success, and she greeted Alberta with the kind of direct and uncomplicated delight that very young people are capable of when they have not yet learned to be suspicious of new things. James Holloway was 5 years old and possessed of a scientific disposition that expressed itself primarily as an urgent need to show Alberta every insect he had ever caught in a jar. He was also, Alberta discovered within the first 20 minutes, left-handed, which mattered because there was still a great deal of foolish conventional wisdom about left-handed children that she had no intention of enforcing. Matthew Holloway himself said 14 words to her on that first afternoon. She counted. He told her where she would sleep, which was a small room at the back of the house that had previously been used for storage and had been cleared out and furnished simply and carefully for her arrival. He told her the children's meal times. He told her the schoolroom he had built was in the outbuilding to the east of the house, which was small but dry and had a proper stove for the cold months. And then he took off his hat, said, "I am grateful you came," in a voice that suggested he had rehearsed it, and went back to work. Alberta stood in the middle of the ranch yard with her 2 trunks and the clean Colorado sky above her and thought, well, here we are then. She set up the schoolroom over the following 2 days. She had brought with her a good supply of primers, a McGuffey reader, a spelling book, 2 slates and a box of chalk, a globe of moderate accuracy, and a collection of literature she had assembled herself because she believed that children should encounter language at its most beautiful as early as possible. She arranged the small room with 2 low tables and chairs, a proper writing surface, and a shelf for the books, and she put a clean piece of chalk to the small blackboard she had requested the school board provide and wrote in clear letters across the top, "The world is made of words." On Monday morning, Clara ran across the yard before breakfast was fully on the table. James followed at a slightly more scientific pace, pausing to observe an interesting beetle on the porch step. Matthew stood at the kitchen window and watched his children disappear into the schoolroom, and something moved across his face that Alberta, passing through on her way to begin the lesson, almost missed. It was relief, she thought, but it was also something more fragile than relief. Something that looked like hope showing its edge for the first time in a long time. The first lessons went beautifully. Clara had a natural facility for letters that made Alberta want to weep with the pleasure of teaching someone so hungry for knowledge. She absorbed her alphabet with fierce concentration and moved on to simple words with the momentum of something that had been dammed and was finally flowing. James was slower but more methodical. He needed to understand why the letter A made the sounds it made before he was willing to accept that it did, and Alberta respected that profoundly and spent considerable time explaining the logic of the English language, such as it was. She was 3 days into the work when the door of the schoolroom opened in the middle of the afternoon lesson, and Matthew Holloway stepped inside. He took off his hat. He looked around the room with an expression she could not quite read. Clara was in the middle of copying a sentence onto her slate, her tongue pressed between her teeth in concentration. James was practicing writing the letter J, which was his letter and therefore felt important. "I did not mean to interrupt," Matthew said, in a voice so carefully quiet that Alberta had the sudden impression he was afraid of breaking something. "You are not interrupting," Alberta said, which was true and also felt like more than a statement of fact. He found a place against the back wall, leaning against it with his hat in his hands, and he watched. Not her, or not primarily her, he watched his children. He watched Clara form her letters with the careful ferocity of someone who understood that this was a key to something larger, and he watched James investigate the logic of his J with the patience of a small natural philosopher. And the expression on Matthew Holloway's face was the most privately emotional thing Alberta had ever been allowed to observe in another person. He stayed for 20 minutes. Then he put his hat back on, said, "Thank you, Miss Underwood," and went back outside. He came back the next day, and the day after that. By the end of the second week, it had become simply the way things were. Matthew Holloway came to his children's lessons every afternoon when his work allowed, which was not always but was often enough that Alberta began to feel his absence on the days he did not appear. He sat against the back wall, or sometimes he pulled a spare chair to the side of the room, and he watched with that quality of quiet attention that she was coming to understand was his fundamental nature, the way he engaged with everything that mattered to him. He said very little during the lessons. Occasionally, if Clara was struggling with a particular word, he would lean forward slightly, as if he wanted to help but was resisting interfering with the work. Once, when James could not get the angle of his letters right and was growing frustrated, Matthew quietly moved his chair to sit beside his son and placed his large hand over James's small one and guided it through the shape of the letter with such tenderness that Alberta had to look away at the blackboard and pretend to be reviewing her lesson plan. She had not expected this. She had not expected any of this. She had come here running from a trap, from a suffocating life and a loveless engagement, and the particular quiet desperation of a woman who wanted more than what was being offered to her. She had come here to do honest work in a wide landscape and give herself room to breathe. She had absolutely not come here to feel her heart rearrange itself around the sight of a taciturn rancher sitting in the back of a children's schoolroom holding his hat in his hands and watching his daughter read. But the heart does not ask permission. The conversations began slowly. They always do with people who have learned to be careful. It started with books. Alberta had set a copy of David Copperfield on the schoolroom shelf because she intended to read it aloud to the children in installments, and one evening she found it sitting on the kitchen table with a slip of paper tucked inside marking the place where she had left off. She looked up and Matthew was at the stove, stirring something, and he said without turning around, "I read ahead. I hope that does not cause offense." "It does not," she said. "What did you think of Mr. Micawber?" He considered this for a long moment, the spoon moving in slow circles. "I think Dickens understood very well that the most dangerous kind of man is the one who genuinely believes his own optimism." Alberta pulled out a chair and sat down at the kitchen table. "That is an interesting reading of him. He reminded me of someone I once knew," Matthew said. He still did not turn around. "A man who always believed that something was going to turn up and meanwhile left his family in a condition of permanent uncertainty." "Was this man your father?" Alberta asked, because she had learned quickly that Matthew Holloway did not respond well to being handled gently around the truth. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "My grandfather," but the pattern repeated. That was the most he said about his family on that occasion, but the door had opened, and after that the evenings began to change. After the children were in bed, there was a period of maybe an hour before the practical demands of ranch life required Matthew to review his accounts or plan the next day's work, and Alberta had taken to sitting in the main room of the house with her own reading. The oil lamps were good and the house was quiet, and it was simply the most peaceful part of her day. Matthew began to find reasons to be in that room during that hour. He brought his account books. He brought harness that needed mending. He brought maps of the ranch's eastern pastures that he was considering expanding. He did not always talk, and she did not always talk, and somewhere in the comfortable silence between two people who both knew what they were doing but had not yet said so out loud, something was building. Alberta was reading to the children from Treasure Island one afternoon in late June when Matthew came in and sat in his usual place, and Clara immediately climbed off her chair and went to sit in her father's lap with the natural confidence of a child who has never been turned away, and Matthew folded his arms around his daughter with the same automatic ease and kept his eyes on Alberta as she read. She was reading the scene where Jim Hawkins first understands the nature of the danger he is in, and she was aware of Matthew's attention on her in a way she was becoming increasingly unable to dismiss as professional. The way he watched her when she read was different from the way he watched her when she was teaching. It had something specific and personal in it that made her turn the pages a little more carefully than necessary. When the lesson ended and James ran off to check on something important in the yard, and Clara stayed to look at the pictures in the book, Matthew lingered by the door. "You read very well," he said. "Thank you." "I mean, you read the way people do when they love what they are reading. Not everyone does that. It matters for children. They can tell the difference." Alberta looked at him. "Do you read that way?" "I used to," he said. Before he stopped, began again. "I am starting to remember how." The summer deepened into the specific blue-gold beauty of a Colorado Territory summer, which Alberta had not been prepared for in her most optimistic imaginings about the West. The sky was enormous in a way that was almost aggressive. It did not allow you to forget its size, and it changed so continuously, and with such theatrical commitment that she sometimes stopped in the middle of walking between the house and the schoolroom just to look at it. She began to know the ranch in the way you know a place that has gotten into your bones. She knew which boards on the porch were loose. She knew that the cattle in the south pasture were more settled than the ones in the east, and that the east ones would occasionally produce a single rebellious individual who caused Matthew significant frustration. She knew that Mrs. Deering arrived at exactly 7:15 on Tuesday mornings, and that her arrival was always preceded by the sound of her horse's particular trot, which had an uneven rhythm due to an old injury that had healed crooked. She knew that Matthew Holloway was afraid of very little except losing people he loved. This last piece of knowledge assembled itself gradually from many small observations. The way he checked on the children before he went asleep each night, even on nights when he had been working since before dawn and could barely stay upright. The way he had built the schoolroom to last, not just functional, but solid, with proper windows that latched securely and a roof that could handle heavy snow, because he had thought about all the ways it could go wrong and addressed them. The way he sometimes stood on the porch in the evening looking out at the land, with an expression that was not quite peace and not quite grief, but something that lived in the space between the two. She understood, gradually and then all at once, that Eleanor Holloway's death had not just broken Matthew's heart. It had given him a dark and specific fear, the fear that caring for something meant opening yourself to a loss so total that you might not survive it. And so he had put a great deal of careful, systematic energy into loving his children without letting himself love anything else. Until, apparently, he had started sitting in on lessons. One morning in July, when the heat was building toward afternoon and the children were taking their midday rest, Matthew found Alberta in the kitchen where she was writing letters home to Cincinnati. He stood in the doorway for a moment, and she looked up, and there was something deliberate in his expression that made her set her pen down. "I want to ask you something," he said. "Then ask," she said. "Why did you come here?" He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down in it, setting his hat on the table between them like a small declaration of intention. "Not to Colorado. I know about the school board placement. I mean, why a private ranch? Why 14 miles from a town? There are women who want this kind of work and come to it from practical necessity. You do not seem like a woman who came here from practical necessity." Alberta looked at her letter. In it she had been telling her sister about the ranch, about the children, about the landscape, and she had been very carefully not saying certain other things that were becoming difficult to continue not saying. "I was engaged," she said, "to a man who was perfectly decent and entirely wrong for me, and I had a life that was comfortable and suffocating in equal measure, and I read an advertisement in a church newsletter." She paused. "That sounds foolish," said aloud. "It does not," Matthew said. "It sounds honest. I wanted to do something that mattered," she said. "I wanted to be somewhere I could breathe." She stopped, because the next thing she had been about to say was, "I wanted to find out what I was actually made of," and that felt like the kind of truth that was hard to hand to another person in the middle of a July afternoon without having prepared them for it. "You wanted to find out who you were without the frame around you telling you the shape," Matthew said. She looked at him. "Yes, I understand that," he said simply, and she believed him. It was in August that things changed between them. Or rather, it was in August that the change that had been happening for 3 months became impossible to pretend otherwise about. The incident that precipitated it was small and mundane, and involved a thunderstorm. Colorado Territory was given to spectacular summer storms, and this one rolled in fast from the northwest, while Alberta was finishing the afternoon lesson, building from a distant rumble to a crashing overhead performance in about 20 minutes. The children were thrilled. James wanted to go outside and observe the lightning scientifically, which Alberta declined to allow. Clara wanted to count the seconds between lightning and thunder, which Alberta thought was excellent applied arithmetic and permitted entirely. When the storm peaked, the wind came up hard enough to rattle the schoolroom windows, and the rain hit the roof with the intensity of something deliberately applied, and Alberta went to latch the window on the east side more securely and found that the latch was stiff. And while she was wrestling with it, the window blew inward and soaked her completely from shoulder to waist. Matthew appeared in the schoolroom doorway approximately 30 seconds later, already moving fast, clearly having seen the window blow from the house. He took in the situation, the wet window, the soaked schoolteacher, the delighted children in about half a second. Then he crossed the room and latched the window properly with one firm motion, and turned to Alberta, and reached out without apparently thinking about it and brushed a wet strand of hair back from her face. They both went very still. His hand was still near her cheek. The children were counting 14 seconds. Clara announced, "He is not very close," and the rain was loud on the roof, and Matthew Holloway's eyes were on Alberta Underwood's face with an expression that had finally stopped being careful. "I should," she started. "Yes," he said, but he did not move, neither did she. It was Clara who broke it, announcing that she wanted hot chocolate because thunderstorms were hot chocolate weather, a position she presented with such confident logic that both adults found themselves moving toward the house and the kitchen and the sensible world of cocoa and warm stoves, while something unnamed but fully formed walked quietly between them. Matthew did not say anything about the moment in the schoolroom. Alberta did not say anything about it either. But she noticed that at dinner he passed her the bread before she could ask for it, and that his hand brushed hers when she took it, and that he did not look away when it happened. September brought the first cooler mornings and the specific quality of Colorado light that came with the turning season, and it brought the annual visit of Matthew's neighbor and friend, a man named Reuben Cross, who ran a cattle operation about 6 miles to the west, and who arrived with a great deal of energy, and a habit of saying everything he was thinking regardless of whether it was entirely politic. Reuben took one long look at the situation at Holloway Ranch, the schoolroom, the lessons, the evenings, the way Matthew automatically tracked Alberta's position in any room they shared, and pulled Matthew aside on his first afternoon there with the subtlety of a man who had never been accused of subtlety. Alberta was inside reading to the children and could not hear what Reuben said. But she saw Matthew's expression when he came back inside, which was the expression of a man who had just had a truth told to him that he already knew but had been successfully avoiding. He watched her through dinner with that expression. She watched him watching her and felt her heart conducting itself in a way that was entirely unprofessional. After the children were in bed and Reuben had gone to his designated guest room with the thoughtful discretion of a man who was, underneath the bluntness, a genuine friend, Matthew came to the main room where Alberta was sitting with her book. He sat in the chair across from her. He did not bring harness to mend or accounts to review. He just sat there with his hands loose between his knees looking at her. "I need to tell you something," he said. "All right," she said. She closed her book. "I am aware," he said, with the careful, precise diction of a man choosing his words from a very serious supply, "that your position here is a professional one and that I asked you to come here to teach my children and that what I'm about to say may be inappropriate given that context." "Matthew," she said. "Let me get through it," he said. She pressed her lips together and waited. "I have not," he stopped, started again. "When Alina died, I decided certain things about how I was going to live. I was going to work. I was going to raise my children as well as I possibly could. I was going to be present and reliable and careful. And I was not going to," he looked at his hands. "I was not going to let myself feel the kind of thing that could be taken from you in a winter fever, because I did not think I could survive it a second time." The room was quiet. The oil lamp made its small, consistent sound. "And then you came," he said, And you wrote the world is made of words on my children's blackboard, and you let my son be left-handed without making it into a problem. And you made my daughter believe she could read anything that was ever written, which she will, and she is going to be extraordinary because of it. And you, his voice dropped. You sat in my kitchen in the evenings and you did not need me to fill all the silence, and I had forgotten what that felt like. Alberta's hands were very still in her lap. I am not good at this, Matthew said. I was not good at it even before I had reason to be afraid of it, but I think you should know that when you are not in the room, I notice. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, I noticed too. Something shifted in his face. Not dramatically, Matthew Holloway was not a dramatic man, but it was visible and real, and it undid her a little. I did not come here looking for this, she said. I want you to know that. I came here because I needed to change my life, and this seemed like the right direction. I did not come here with any plan beyond the children. I know that, he said, but she paused. This was the moment. This was where she should have told him, and she knew it, and she would later understand that her failure to tell him in this moment was the stone she would have to carry until it became too heavy. I am glad I came, she said instead. He nodded. Then he said very quietly, May I call you Alberta? She smiled. You just did, I know. And he smiled back, and it was the first time she had seen his face do that fully and without reservation, and it was something she felt in her whole body. They did not do anything dramatic that night. He was not a man given to dramatic gestures, and she was not a woman who required them. He walked her to the door of her room, as he sometimes did now when they had been talking late, and he paused there for a moment, and he said good night, and his voice was warm with something that had not been in it before, and she lay awake for a long time afterward with her heart doing things she had no control over. October was extraordinary. Alberta had not been prepared for a Colorado autumn any more than she had been prepared for the summer, and the aspens on the nearby ridges turned a yellow so pure and bright it looked like the landscape was on fire with something beautiful. She began taking the children on afternoon walks when the weather was good, which Matthew approved of on the grounds that learning happened in the physical world as much as in the schoolroom, and sometimes on these walks he came with them, and those were the best afternoons of her life up to that point. They talked about everything. They talked about the land. He could name every geological feature within 20 miles and explain how it had gotten there, with a rancher's practical understanding of terrain, combined with a reader's curiosity about causes. They talked about the children, Clara's extraordinary hunger for knowledge, James's methodical and beautiful mind. They talked about the books she was teaching from, and the books he had read, and the ones neither of them had read but intended to. They talked about the unjust treatment of the Ute people whose ancestral territory they were standing on, a subject about which Matthew had complicated and honest feelings that she respected deeply. And they talked about the particular injustice of a world that told women like Alberta that their minds were decorative rather than functional. On one such walk, while James was collecting interesting stones and Clara was attempting to climb a fallen aspen log with scientific determination, Matthew said, "Tell me about Gerald Fitch." Alberta was surprised enough by this that she laughed. "That is a very direct question." "I have been thinking about him," Matthew said, in a tone that was almost sheepish, which was a quality she found devastating on him. "Not jealousy, exactly. More, I want to understand why that did not work, so that I understand what worked in its place." She considered him for a moment. "He was a man who had already decided what kind of woman he wanted before he met me," she said, "and I fit the dimensions closely enough that he did not notice I was a different shape entirely. He did not ask me about books I had read. He explained books to me. He did not ask what I thought about anything. He told me what he thought and then waited for agreement." She paused. "He was not cruel. He was simply incurious about me as a person, and I think over the course of a lifetime that would have been worse than cruelty in its way." Matthew was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I am not incurious about you." "No," she said softly, "you are not. I am probably excessively curious about you if I am being honest. I find I do not mind that at all, she said. Clara, from the top of her log, announced that she could see all the way to tomorrow from up here, and they both looked at her and laughed, and Matthew's hand found Alberta's as they walked toward his daughter, and it stayed there, warm and steady, all the way back to the ranch. November brought the cold properly, and the children's lessons moved fully indoors, and the stove in the schoolroom became important, and Matthew began coming to the lessons every day. Not just sitting in the back now, he participated, or he watched so intently that participation was implicit. He asked his daughter questions after she read. He helped James with the arithmetic problems that required practical understanding, turning abstract numbers into cattle and fence posts and acres. One afternoon, Alberta taught the children about sentences, about how a sentence was a complete thought, about subjects and predicates, about how the most important thing was that the thought had to be finished. She made them each write a sentence on their slates, and she asked Matthew at the back of the room if he would like to write one too. He looked at her with an expression she could not entirely read. Then he picked up a spare piece of chalk and wrote his sentence on the back of his slate. He turned it to face her. It said, "The world is made of words, but some things cannot be said." She looked at it for a long moment. Then she wrote her own sentence on the board where everyone could see. It said, "Yet." He stared at it. Then, very slowly, he smiled. It was in December that the letter came. Alberta had known it would come eventually. The letter was from her former employer at the Millbrook Academy in Cincinnati, a woman named Mrs. Hartley, who was not a bad person but was a deeply connected one. And what Mrs. Hartley had written, in her precise and slightly accusatory hand, was that she had heard from Gerald Fitch's family that Alberta had left Ohio under something of a cloud, and that while Mrs. Hartley wished her well, she felt it her duty to inform Alberta that Gerald had been speaking quite freely about the circumstances of the broken engagement, and that the version of events he was circulating was not entirely flattering to Alberta's character, and that Mrs. Hartley had felt it necessary to share this because she cared about Alberta's reputation, and because a copy of the same letter had been sent to the Colorado Territory School Board. The school board version, which arrived 2 days after Mrs. Hartley's, was considerably less gentle. It noted that an inquiry had been made regarding Miss Underwood's conduct prior to her placement, that concerns had been raised about her moral character, given the circumstances of her departure from Cincinnati, and that the board would need to review her placement pending further investigation. The investigation, such as it was Gerald Fitch's version of events, that Alberta had behaved improperly, had broken a sacred promise, had abandoned her obligations and her family, and had fled west to avoid accountability. None of this was true in the way he presented it, but it was not completely without a frame of facts, and the frame was enough to make it dangerous. What made it a dark past that could destroy her was this: Alberta had not told Matthew any of it. She had mentioned the engagement. She had mentioned leaving it. She had not mentioned that Gerald Fitch, humiliated and vindictive, had spent the better part of a year working to damage her reputation through every social and professional channel available to him. She had not mentioned that she had received 2 earlier letters warning her of this campaign and had chosen, each time, not to tell Matthew, because she was afraid of what he would think not of Gerald's story, but of the fact that she had kept it from him. It was the secret she carried, the hidden weight. Not because she was guilty of what Gerald claimed, but because she had been afraid, and she had let that fear make her dishonest by omission. And she knew Matthew Holloway well enough by now to know that omission was a form of lie to a man who valued transparency above almost everything else. The 3rd letter arrived on a Wednesday, and it was not from the school board or from Mrs. Hartley. It was from Gerald Fitch himself, brief and cold and direct. He intended to contest the school board placement formally, and he had enough connections in the territorial government to cause real problems, and the only way to make it stop was for Alberta to return to Cincinnati and resume her life there. It was a trap, a vindictive, small-minded, deeply unjust trap set by a man who could not tolerate being left, but it was a trap with teeth, and it had landed in the middle of everything she had built. She had been sitting with all 3 letters for 2 hours, trying to figure out what to do, when Matthew came in from the afternoon's work and saw her face and put the letters in front of her, and read them all 3 standing at the kitchen table without sitting down, and when he finished reading, he put them back on the table with a sound like a gunshot. "You lied to me," he said, and the whole story came back to the beginning. Alberta stood in the small schoolroom in the December cold, with the stove ticking in the corner and the last of the afternoon light going amber through the windows, and she told Matthew Holloway everything, all of it. Gerald Fitch's campaign, the earlier letters, the reasons she had kept it from him, the fear. He listened without interrupting. That was the quality of him that made it both easier and harder. He gave her the space to say all of it, and the space made it impossible to stop short of the full truth. When she finished, the room was quiet for a long time. "I am not guilty of what he claims," she said. "I want you to know that as clearly as I can say it." "I know that," Matthew said immediately, and the immediacy of it nearly undid her. "That was never, Alberta, I know your character. I have lived with your character for 8 months. Gerald Fitch's opinion of it is not something I am spending any energy on." "Then what, the not telling me?" he said. "That is what I am sitting with." He moved to the window and stood with his back to her for a moment, and when he turned back his face was in shadow. I have been allowing myself to feel something I swore I was not going to feel again. And one of the things that made it feel safe, or as close to safe as it is possible to feel, was that I trusted you. That you were the kind of person who did not manage things, who did not decide what I deserved to know and what I should be protected from. "I know," she said. "I have had enough of being managed," he said very quietly. "Aliner's family managed things. After she died, there were things they did not tell me, decisions they made on my behalf, information they held back because they thought they were protecting me. And it felt," he stopped. "It felt like the ground went out from under me again when I found out. Not because of the things themselves, but because the people I trusted had decided I was not capable of being trusted with the truth." Alberta's throat was tight. "Matthew, I am so sorry. I know you are." He crossed his arms over his chest, not in anger but in the posture of a man holding himself carefully together. "I know, and I know your reasons were fear and not the same thing as what they did, but the feeling is the same, and I need a moment to," he exhaled, "to let the feeling be what it is without letting it become more than what it is." She waited. She had learned how to wait for him, how his mind moved, how he needed space to find the right path through, how pressing him before he was ready produced nothing useful and cost something real. The light outside was going. Clara's voice drifted in from the yard, calling for James. "The school board," he said finally. "What do you want to do about the school board?" She blinked. I want to keep teaching your children, that is what I want." "Then that is what you will do," he said, with a simple finality that startled her. "I will write to the school board myself. I will write to the territorial government if I need to. Reuben Cross knows the territorial superintendent and owes me a considerable favor. Gerald Fitch does not know what he has gotten himself into. Matthew, I am not protecting you from him because you need protecting," he said, and now something fierce had come into his voice, something warm under the firmness. "You are entirely capable of protecting yourself. I am doing it because he is wrong and the truth matters, and I am in a position to put resources behind it." He looked at her directly. "And because you are," he paused, "because you are not something I am willing to let a vindictive man from Cincinnati take away from me." The room was quiet again, but a different kind of quiet. "You are still angry with me," Alberta said. "I am still hurt," he corrected. "There is a difference. You can be in love with someone and be hurt by them at the same time." She heard what he had said. She was fairly certain he had not entirely meant to say it in precisely that way, because something flickered across his face immediately afterward, Not regret exactly, but the look of a man who had just found himself further into a conversation than he had planned. "In love," she said very softly. He met her eyes, held them. "Yes," he said, simply, wholly, without any of the careful framing he usually used to approach the things that mattered most to him. Just, yes. Alberta felt tears come to her eyes, which surprised her, because she was not generally a woman who cried easily. She blinked them back firmly. "I am in love with you too," she said. "I have been for a long time, and I have been very stupid about how I handled the fear of it." "We have both been stupid," he said, "in roughly equal measure. That is generous. It is accurate." He uncrossed his arms. He moved toward her, slow and deliberate, the way he moved toward everything that mattered. I need to get used to the idea that it is possible to love something and not lose it. I am still learning that." "I know," she said. "I am not going anywhere." He stopped in front of her. He reached up and took her face gently in both his large, work-worn hands and looked at her with the full weight of his attention, all that gravity, all that stillness, and said, "I am going to need you to promise me that you will tell me things, even the things you are afraid of, especially those." "I promise," she said, and she meant it in the deepest part of herself. "I promise, Matthew." He pressed his forehead to hers, and they stood like that in the small, warm schoolroom while the Colorado evening came down outside, and Clara's voice called for James, and the stove ticked, and neither of them moved. He kissed her eventually. It was like everything he did, careful and deliberate and warm, and it was nothing like anything Alberta had experienced before, and she understood in that moment that this was what it felt like when something was exactly right, not convenient, not comfortable, not safely within expectations, but precisely, specifically, undeniably right. Matthew wrote to the school board the next morning. He wrote 4 pages in his clear, firm hand, and asked Alberta to add her own account, which she did in 3 pages of her own. Reuben Cross arrived that afternoon with a kind of energy that suggested he had been waiting for this moment, and he sat at the kitchen table and wrote his own letter to the territorial superintendent, and then added a second letter from 3 neighboring ranchers whose children Alberta had occasionally tutored when they visited the ranch, and whose testimonies were enthusiastic and specific. The combined effect was considerable. The investigation was conducted, such as it was, and the truth of Alberta's character and the professional quality of her work was established without much difficulty. Gerald Fitch's complaint was reviewed and found to be without substance. What was harder and what took longer was the letter that Alberta wrote to Gerald Fitch himself. She wrote it in the kitchen on a December evening while Matthew sat across from her doing his accounts, and she did not ask him to leave, and he did not leave. She wrote it plainly and without anger and without apology. She told Gerald that she wished him no harm, that she genuinely hoped he would find a woman who suited him, that she was not coming back to Cincinnati, and that she wished him to stop. She sealed it and addressed it and gave it to Cord to carry into town with the next mail run. She never heard from Gerald Fitch again. December moved toward Christmas, and the ranch settled into the rhythms of the cold season. Alberta and Clara were working their way through a proper chapter book, now Little Women, which Clara had declared to be her absolute favorite thing she had ever read, particularly Joe, in a way that Alberta found entirely predictable and deeply endearing. James had moved past basic arithmetic and was working with a ferocious enthusiasm on multiplication, which he approached as a kind of mystery to be systematically solved, and was reading full pages of text with the careful thoroughness of someone who understood that reading was an investment. Matthew had stopped sitting at the back of the schoolroom. He sat at the side now, close enough to the lesson to be a participant when he was there, which was every day without exception, regardless of what was happening on the ranch. Reuben Cross, on his next visit, pointed out that Matthew was managing to run his cattle operation successfully while spending 2 hours every afternoon in a schoolroom, and that this probably said something about what he actually considered important. It says something about Alberta, Matthew said, with no particular embarrassment. Yes, it does, Reuben agreed with considerable satisfaction. On Christmas Eve, Matthew and Alberta put the children to bed early with the aid of a story about St. Nicholas that Alberta told with enough dramatic embellishment to keep Clara and James completely riveted. And then they sat together in the main room of the house, where Matthew had brought in a small pine tree, and Alberta had helped the children decorate it that afternoon with paper chains and a few glass ornaments that had come across from the east in an old trunk of Aline's things. Matthew had been careful about the ornaments. He had brought the trunk down from the attic with a particular kind of quietness, and explained to the children that these had been their mothers, and that it seemed right to use them, and Clara had held each one with a reverence that told Alberta everything about the quality of the grief and the quality of the love in this family. Now the tree stood in the corner with its ornaments catching the lamp light, and Matthew was sitting close to Alberta on the small settee that had always been too narrow for the space, but that she had come to associate entirely with evenings like this one, and his arm was around her in the natural, unself-conscious way that had developed over the past weeks, not dramatically, not as a declaration, just as the way they were now. "I want to ask you something," he said. "That phrase has worked out all right for us before," she said. He smiled. "I want to ask you whether, when your contract with the school board ends in the spring, you would consider making a different arrangement." She looked up at him. "What kind of arrangement?" "A permanent one," he said. "A permanent one in which you continue to teach my children, but as their mother rather than as their teacher, and in which this is your home, and I am your husband, and neither of those things has an end point." Alberta's heart was very full. She thought about the advertisement in the church newsletter. She thought about the westbound train and the hired wagon and the long red road into a wide valley. She thought about the world is made of words on a small blackboard, and yet written underneath it. "You are proposing to me in the parlor on Christmas Eve," she said. "I would have done it more formally," he said, "but I could not find a moment in the past 2 weeks when I felt confident the children would not appear from somewhere and make it into an event." She laughed, fully and completely, and he looked at her with that smile, the one that was entirely unguarded. "Yes," she said. "Matthew, yes. Entirely and completely yes." He kissed her again, and this time it held all the weight of what it was, a beginning that had already been secretly underway for months, finally acknowledged and named. They were married in March, when the early spring was just touching the edges of the land and the meadows below the ranch were beginning to go green. The ceremony was in the church in town, small and straightforward, the way both of them wanted it. Reuben Cross was Matthew's witness. A woman named Helen Farrar, who ran the town's small dry goods store and had become Alberta's first genuine friend in Colorado, was hers. Clara wore her best dress and took her role as the eldest child of the family with tremendous seriousness, and James discovered that the church had an interesting echo and spent a portion of the service testing it in a scientific manner that the minister tolerated with visible effort. Alberta became Alberta Holloway on a March afternoon in 1879, and she stood in front of a small congregation of ranchers and townspeople and said the words that meant she was choosing this life, this place, this man, choosing it with full knowledge and full intention, which was something she had never been able to say about anything before. Matthew looked at her through the whole ceremony with an expression that was not performed for the audience. It was private and real, and it was entirely for her. They drove back to the ranch in the late afternoon, the children asleep against each other in the back of the wagon, and the sky doing its enormous Colorado thing above them and Matthew's hand warm over hers on the seat between them. "How do you feel?" he asked. "Like the world is very large and very good," she said. He squeezed her hand once firmly. "Yes," he said, "that is exactly how I feel." Spring became summer, and the ranch was different with Alberta as part of it rather than just resident in it. She had opinions about the kitchen garden that she pursued with considerable energy. converting a neglected patch behind the house into a productive and somewhat ambitious growing project that Matthew observed with respect and occasional gentle skepticism about the size of the stakes she was using for the tomatoes. She had opinions about the books available in town, and she wrote to publishers in Denver and Chicago to supplement them. And slowly the shelves in the main room filled up in a way that Matthew said made the house feel more like itself. The schoolroom continued. If anything, it became more alive. Clara was 9 now and reading well above her years, and had begun to write her own stories, which she would read aloud to the family after dinner, with an authority that suggested she was already aware she was remarkable. James was 7 and had developed a consuming interest in geography, and Alberta had begun incorporating the globe into every possible lesson, and James would spend long periods rotating it with careful attention, asking questions about distances and climates with the focused intensity of a child assembling something very large in his head. Matthew came to every lesson. This did not change. He worked longer hours in summer to compensate, was up before the light, and managed what needed managing in the early mornings so that he could be in the schoolroom in the afternoons. Alberta had stopped finding this surprising and started finding it simply one of the constant true things about the man she had married. One afternoon in late summer, when the lessons were finished and the children had gone out into the yard, Alberta found him standing at the small blackboard looking at it. The words she had written on her first day, "The world is made of words," were gone, replaced by whatever she had written for that day's lesson, which was something about adjectives. He had a piece of chalk in his hand. "May I?" he asked. "Always," she said. He wrote at the bottom of the board under the adjective lesson, yet she looked at it, she looked at him. "We have come full circle," she said. "Not full circle," he said. "Farther out." He set the chalk down. "I was thinking about the word I would choose if I had to choose one word to describe this year. And I keep landing on found," he said, "which is not how I expected to feel about anything." He stopped and turned to face her fully, leaning against the small desk she used during lessons. His arms crossed in that way he had when he was saying something he meant deeply. "I had organized myself around a version of my life that had very precise edges. I knew what was inside them and I knew what was outside. And then you came and the edges stopped making sense, and now I cannot remember what I was so carefully protecting." "You were protecting yourself," she said gently. "I know, but I was wrong about what the protection cost." He looked at her with eyes she knew by heart now, every shade of them. "It cost everything I am looking at." She went to him. She put her hands flat against his chest and looked up at him and said, "I am not going anywhere. I told you that at the beginning." "I know," he said, and put his arms around her, warm and certain. "I know you did." That autumn, Alberta told Matthew she was expecting a child. She told him in the kitchen in the early morning, before the children were awake, with the October light just beginning at the windows and the smell of the coffee she had made because she needed something to do with her hands. She said it plainly because that was always the best way with him. She said she was quite certain, and that by her estimation the child would arrive in the late spring, and then she watched his face. He stared at her for a long moment. Something moved through his expression that she could not have named. Not one thing but many things, layered and deep. The way emotion moves in a person who has learned to feel deeply and carefully rather than all at once. Then he pulled her into his arms and held her with a completeness that said everything his voice was too full to say right then, and she pressed her face against his chest and felt his heartbeat, fast and strong, and understood that this was what it meant to be entirely somewhere. He said into her hair, "I thought I know," she said. After a leaner he stopped. She felt him breathe through it, consciously, the way she had watched him do when something large came at him. "I did not know whether You are going to be wonderful," she said. "You already are." "We are going to be wonderful," he corrected, which made her smile against his chest. They told the children at breakfast. Clara took this information with the gravity and excitement of someone who had already imagined being a big sister approximately 300 times. James asked several methodical questions about the logistics of where the baby would sleep and how long it would take before the baby could understand things, and seemed satisfied by the answers. The pregnancy moved through the winter with the ordinary, extraordinary progress of such things. Alberta kept teaching through the cold months, which she had no intention of not doing, modifying the physical demands as needed and ignoring the raised eyebrow of the doctor in town, who seemed to feel that pregnant women should be resting rather than instructing children in letters. Matthew said nothing about the doctor's opinion, but he made sure the schoolroom stove was always well stocked, and that the walk between the house and the schoolroom was cleared of ice, and that there was always something warm for her to drink when she came in. He was, she realized, being careful, but for the first time in the years she had known him, his carefulness was not the kind that came from fear. It was the kind that came from love. The baby arrived in May of 1880, on a morning that was warm and brilliant, and it was a boy. Matthew held his son in the first minutes with the expression of a man who has discovered that the world is much larger than he thought, and that this is entirely welcome. They named him Edward, after Alberta's grandfather, whom she had loved very much and who had given her her first proper book. Edward was a round, serious-faced, dark-haired baby who from his earliest weeks showed a quality of attentiveness that made the family say he was taking notes. "He is going to be the most educated person we have ever produced," Reuben Cross observed on a visit, looking down at the baby with what was clearly genuine affection. "Given who is teaching him." "Teaching has not started yet," Alberta said. "Has it not?" Matthew said, from where he was sitting with Edward against his chest, speaking quietly to the infant about the history of the ranch and the names of the cattle and the quality of the spring pastures. He looked up at Alberta over the baby's head. "I started sitting in on lessons very early." "You did," she agreed, smiling. "And look where that got you." He looked at the baby. He looked at Clara at the kitchen table with her latest story spread out in front of her, writing with complete absorption. He looked at James at the window, studying the movement of birds with that careful scientific attention. He looked at Alberta, with Edward's weight small and warm on his chest, and his expression was everything the word found could contain and more. "It got me everything," he said. "The years that followed were full in all the ways that matter." The ranch grew, Matthew's careful management and Reuben's friendship, and the good years of rain, meant that the operation expanded steadily, adding pasture and stock without losing the particular quality of the place that made it feel like something more than a business. The house grew too, or rather it was expanded. Matthew added 2 proper rooms to the south side in the summer of 1881, a project that he enlisted Clara and James in on the weekends, teaching them the practical mathematics of construction in a way that Alberta watched with great appreciation from the porch. The schoolroom remained. Clara outgrew it eventually, in the sense that she was ready for more than Alberta could provide in a one-room operation 14 miles from anywhere. And at 13, she went to a proper school in Denver that had been established for girls, and that had a reputation for taking intelligent young women seriously. She left with every book she owned in a trunk, and a letter of introduction from Alberta that the head mistress of the Denver school later told Alberta was the most honestly written assessment of a student's abilities she had ever received. Clara wrote home twice a week, long letters full of what she was learning and what she thought about it, and Alberta wrote back with equal length and frequency, and the correspondence between them was the best kind of continuity, the kind that proved the teaching had worked. James stayed on at the ranch for longer, his scientific interests finding ample material in the land itself, and Alberta continued his education through an advanced curriculum she designed herself, supplemented by correspondence courses and books ordered from Chicago. He had a particular gift for mathematics that, by the time he was 12, had exceeded Alberta's ability to stay ahead of it, and she told Matthew with honest pride that their son was going to need a proper university at some point, which was a sentence that made Matthew's eyes go bright with a complicated and beautiful feeling. Edward grew into a child of considerable verbal talent, which surprised absolutely no one, given that he had been hearing Alberta read aloud since before he could sit up. He was talking in full, grammatically complex sentences by the time he was 2.5, to the delight of everyone and the mild alarm of the visiting minister, who felt that a child should demonstrate more appropriate humility about the extent of his vocabulary. In the spring of 1882, Alberta had a daughter. They named her Margaret, called Maggie from the first day, a red-haired, loud-opinionated baby who arrived with the apparent intention of immediately taking charge of every situation she found herself in. Matthew held her with the same careful completeness he held all his children, and looked at Alberta over the baby's head and said, "She is going to be magnificent." "She is going to be difficult," Alberta said with great affection. "The best ones always are," Matthew said. Alberta thought about that. She thought about the world is made of words and yet, and a church newsletter advertisement and a westbound train, and the first day she walked across a ranch yard with 2 trunks in the clean sky overhead. She thought about a man who had loved carefully and with great intention and learned how to love without the armor. "I suppose that is true," she said. The best ones always are. The schoolroom continued to be used. Edward and Maggie came up through it in their turn, sitting at the same low tables where Clara and James had sat, writing on slates and working through McGuffey readers, and having David Copperfield and Treasure Island read to them in installments by their mother, who read the way people do when they love what they are reading. And Matthew came to those lessons too, right up until Edward was 12 and Maggie was 10, and the curriculum had expanded beyond what the small room could contain. He sat in the back, or at the side with his hat in his hands or not, and he watched his children learn the shape of the world. Alberta caught him sometimes, watching her instead of the children, with that specific attention of his, that quality of gravity that was his natural mode when it came to the things he loved most. And she would return the look, steady and warm, across the heads of their children, and the look said everything that could not be fully said out loud, that it had been worth it, every step, the train and the fear and the letters and the storm and the argument in the December schoolroom and the marriage in the March church and all the years between. It had all been worth precisely this. One evening in the autumn of 1885, when Edward was 5 and Maggie was 3 and the older 2 were away at their respective schools, and the house had the particular quiet of a home that is not empty but is briefly still, Matthew found Alberta in the schoolroom after supper. She was writing at her desk, updating the curriculum for the next month. The lamp was burning warm. The stove was going. Outside, the Colorado sky was full of stars in that particular abundance it had at altitude, and the night was cold and clear and very beautiful. He came in and stood in the doorway, and she looked up. "What are you doing?" she asked. He crossed the room and sat down in the chair he had been sitting in since the second week of her arrival at his ranch, the chair against the wall that had become as much his as anything else here. He set his hat on his knee. He looked around the room with the eyes of a man who has been somewhere long enough to see everything in it, and he said, "I am sitting in on lessons." Alberta put down her pen. "The lesson is not until tomorrow morning." "I know." He looked at her, calm and fully present. "I wanted to practice." She looked at him for a long moment. The man she had come to know in all his dimensions, the grief he had carried and set down, the fear he had faced and moved through, the love he had offered carefully and then freely and then completely. The father who held his children's hands through the shapes of letters. The rancher who read Dickens and thought about it afterward. The husband who had put his forehead against hers in a December schoolroom and asked her to promise him the truth. "Matthew," she said. "Yes," he said. "I love you," she said. Very specifically and completely, and without any remaining reservations. He smiled, that full, unguarded smile that she had first seen on a Christmas evening in this same room years ago, and that still did the same thing to her that it had always done. "I love you," he said, in the same voice he used for the truest things, the simple ones. very specifically and completely, and I am grateful every day that you read that advertisement in a church newsletter. You were worth the westbound train, she said. I hope so, he said. I intend to go on being worth it. She rose from her desk and crossed the room and sat in the chair beside him, close, their shoulders touching in the warm lamplight of the small schoolroom that had been built to last, on the ranch that had been built to last, in the life they had built together out of books and letters and lessons, and the particular stubborn courage of two people who had decided to stop being afraid. Outside, the stars were thick above the Colorado Territory. The cattle were settled in the south pasture. The house was quiet with sleeping children. Somewhere down the valley, a coyote called once and was answered, and the night held it, and everything was whole. Alberta Holloway, who had once been Alberta Underwood and had come to a wide red valley with two trunks and an unfinished life, sat beside the man she loved in the schoolroom where it had all begun and thought, yes, this, exactly this. The world is made of words, and some of the best ones are, I am home.